Good afternoon, everybody. I think it's working, right? You can hear me? Good? Okay. So I'd like to begin by a very sincere thank you to Venerable Ifa for the invitation to this amazing conference, fascinating conference. Of course, to Naomi for herding all of us cats. I know it's not an easy job. And to the staff and the volunteers who are clearly working very hard to make this all happen. So I'm a Buddhist studies scholar, not a scientist. I work primarily in the area of gender and sexuality. My early work was on the Garbha-avakranti Sutra, which is the Entering the Womb Sutra that Professor Rob Kritzer spoke about in detail yesterday. The Garbha-avakranti Sutra is an exposition of the processes of rebirth and karma, as Rob highlighted yesterday. It's also adjacent to the medical tradition in ancient South Asia. I'm going to reference it and also other adjacent Buddhist traditions from South Asia from a somewhat different angle today. So I have always been primarily interested in these traditions as exercises in what Ben and Henry referred to yesterday as selfing, projects of selfing. So which sorts of selves have moral value and are worthy of, for instance, government concern and protection? There's a lot to say about Buddhist embryological projects in this respect, but today I'm going to focus on the ethics of abortion. Okay. So this is a little rundown of what is happening in the US in the year 2025 with respect to legal access to abortion. The Supreme Court made a decision in 2022 called the Dobbs decision, which has meant the implementation of fairly draconian laws forbidding or limiting abortion in many states. In places like Texas and Georgia, doctors are unsure if it is legal to perform abortion, even in cases where it is medically necessary. And so we have some examples. There are two news stories on your right of women who have actually died because they did not receive medically necessary abortions, which from physicians' point of view in those contexts would have been simply good health care. The public discourse in the US, there are some Americans here who know this all too well, tends to pit the sacrality of innocent life against the bodily autonomy of the mother. So I deliberately do not call this a discussion or a dialogue because it isn't a dialogue or a discussion. The two sides, you could say, pro-life and pro-choice, do not discuss this issue using commensurable terms. They talk past each other. The other thing that's happening in the US, but has happened for quite a while, is that there are many one-issue voters in the US who will vote for a political candidate purely on the basis of their position on abortion. And so what all this boils down to is in the US, it's an example of how these ideas about selfhood, about the moral status of the fetus, does translate into very tangible kind of political and social conditions in ways that are, very immediate. So it's very clear, or fairly clear here, what sorts of selves are especially protected in this scenario. The deep motivations for these policies are metaphysical, political, and gendered. As feminist commentators have explored, the science around embryology is often tapped to support these policies. For instance, multiple states with restrictive laws on abortion have introduced what are called fetal heartbeat laws, which ban abortion at 6 weeks. So we see here, a kind of fact of embryology being rallied, right, to create an ethical dividing line between permissible and impermissible abortion, which then becomes law. In thinking through these questions around the ethics of abortion in my own context, often with my students in the classroom, Buddhist thinking and practice on the question offer an illuminating comparative case study. Now, just to be clear, conservative pro-life thinkers in the US are not interested in what Buddhists have to say. Unfortunately, I wish they were. And I would also say, actually, that people on the pro-choice side are probably not that interested either. But as a thought exercise, the comparison is useful and illuminates some shared, but also distinctive understandings of what is human and what is a self worthy of safeguarding. So there is a fairly robust literature by scholars of Buddhist ethical traditions on the topic of abortion. I have actually found the work of Catholic feminist theologians such as Tina Beatty, whose quote I have here, somewhat more useful. I think Ben provided some good language yesterday for why that's the case. Damian Cohn, Robert Florida, and others who have focused mainly on the question of what is it, i.e. what is the fetus, rather than on relationality. In other words, our relationship to the fetus and its place in our projects of world-making and meaning-making and selfing. And we just got a wonderful example of a kind of relationality towards the fetus from the last speaker. For instance, Catholic feminist theologian Tina Beatty here points out how essential it is to include the perspective of women on the topic of abortion, which is actually something that standard discussions of Buddhist ethics tend not to do. There are a few exceptions. The work of William Lafleur, for instance, I think is inclusive of a variety of perspectives. But in general, the perspectives of women are not included in these analyses. Beatty also points out how, and here I'm just reading part of the quote, our humanity is formed not only by the biological and genetic realities of our existence, but by the linguistic and social conditions of our coming into being. Catholic theologians writing about abortion have also provided some language which I have found useful and which I'll use during this presentation kind of to structure it. So they discern two positions in traditional Catholic thinking on abortion. The ontological, what they call the ontological position, focuses on the personhood and humanity of the fetus, the what is it question. The so-called perversity position focuses on the sexual perversity of women. Ontological arguments against abortion argue on the basis of a metaphysics of the human. Perversity positions against abortion focus on women's errant sexual behavior and see the availability of abortion as facilitating it. And it's actually, according to Beatty, the latter, the perversity position, is actually more typical in Catholic discussions of abortion. So I'm going to use South Asian Buddhism, that's my field of expertise, as a case study here, with a focus on the early and classical tradition, though I jump forward a few times to give contemporary examples. So this is the ontological position in Buddhist context. You'll see it's almost identical if you know something about the way this goes in Catholic context. It's almost identical to its Catholic counterpart. Damian Cohn summarizes it as follows. Premise 1, it is wrong to take innocent human life. Premise 2, from conception onwards, the embryo or fetus is innocent, human, and alive. Conclusion, it is wrong to take the life of an embryo or fetus. Okay, so that's the logic of the ontological position. A source that is often referenced as an authoritative statement on this topic is the Vinaya, the monastic disciplinary code. In fact, a rule forbidding monks to facilitate abortion is included in the section of the code that covers the most serious transgressions. So Parajika 3 states that intentionally killing a human will lead to expulsion from the monastic community, and abortion counts as one such act of killing. The commentary to this part of the code also includes a definition of human that specifically mentions the embryo at the time of conception. This canonical view of abortion is a standard response from Buddhist teachers on the question of abortion when they're asked, what is the Buddhist position on abortion? And these are just two examples from modern Tibetan teachers. This is from an article that was published in the 90s, so it's somewhat out of date, I guess. I have a feeling this is still the response that many Buddhist teachers would probably give. So, for instance, Khenchen Trungpa Rinpoche says, I have no fixed opinion on the matter of family planning. All details of karma are perceptible only to the Buddha. Personally, I see no great fault in preventing conception, but of course, once conception has occurred, to kill the unborn child would be to destroy a sentient being, to commit an act of killing, and would therefore be an unvirtuous action. The canonical view of abortion is a standard response from Buddhist teachers, as I mentioned. But when you turn away from texts and towards abortion practices on the ground in Buddhist South Asia, you see something interesting and arguably informed by Buddhist ethics. So this is just a quick example from Sri Lanka. So I think you often see an ethic of care being practiced despite the strictness of Buddhism and the clarity of Buddhist prohibitions on abortion. So this is a comment from Dakshita Wikmemaratne. I probably butchered that. In a 2024 interview, quite a recent interview. He is a Sri Lankan researcher, activist, and development practitioner focused on sexual and reproductive health and rights. And as you see in the quote, he emphasizes the way that compassion is shown towards women in reproductive crisis in his country. This takes the form of medical care for women who have aborted a fetus, despite Sri Lanka's very strict legal prohibitions on abortion. So abortion is illegal, but women who have had an abortion and have a medical situation will be given care when they come to clinics, right? They won't be turned away because they've done something illegal. And this is actually not the case currently in the US, in all parts of the US. Women are being turned away from medical care. And in some states, they may even be vulnerable to prosecution if they, if they're suspected of having had an abortion. Okay, so that was a flyover of South Asian Buddhist views of abortion. What I'd like to do now is take a closer look at the so-called ontological position taken by so many scholars of Buddhist ethics, and actually, I would say by the classical tradition itself. So while the modern Tibetan teachers whose views I shared on a previous slide follow the Vinaya tradition in answering the question of fetal personhood and the wrongness of abortion very simply and clearly, in fact, if you look at the fine grain of Buddhist metaphysical descriptions of the rebirth process, you begin, and granular descriptions, you begin to introduce some ambiguity and nuance. In some instances, you will see considering the details of the rebirth process has resulted in a tolerance of abortion based not only on compassion, as in the Sri Lankan example, but on ontological arguments about the human status of the fetus. And I'm going to give you a concrete example of that in a little bit. So here is the canonical description from the Pali Sutta collections of conception. We've heard about this a lot. I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but I did want to draw your attention to the expression of concern for the labor, the fear, and the suffering of the mother during pregnancy and birth. This sincere and reality-based expression of concern I have found is somewhat unusual, actually, in Buddhist descriptions of birth. And this is something we'll talk about again as well. So here's some nuance. One nuance is that different Buddhist schools actually disagreed on the nature of the transmigrating consciousness. The main contrast, I'm kind of giving the rough and ready version of this debate. There's a lot of detail to it, but the main contrast is between the Pali commentarial tradition. You can take Buddhaghosa, 5th century scholar, as representative, and the Sanskrit commentarial tradition. You can take the scholar Vasubandhu, 4th, 5th century, as representative of that. So I'm really boiling things down, but there's a good amount of detailed discussion, and I would recommend actually Professor Kritzer's writing on this. You can flag him down. I can give you references as well if you're interested in the details. I am quoting secondary rather than primary texts here on the polycommentarial tradition, just for convenience, but I think Stephen Collins is pretty reliable, I would say. So this tradition posits, rather than an intermediate being that is in a kind of in-between state for a period of time, it posits a linking consciousness, so a basic non-cognizing form of consciousness that links the moment of death in the individual's previous body to the first moment of life at conception. So it's an immediate kind of cause and effect, no time lapse. This linking consciousness is called bhavanga and continues throughout all successive rebirths. It's sometimes translated as stream of consciousness. It's kind of using the sort of Freudian, Jungian language. It provides karmic continuity across lifetimes, but is itself momentary and impermanent. Each moment of bhavanga causes the next. Go here. In the Yogacara and Sarvastivada schools, and again, Rob is really the expert here, but I'm going to just bring it in for the sake of my argument. Instead of relinking consciousness, there is something called the antarabhava, or the intermediate being. This intermediate being carries the consciousness or vijnana that merges with semen and blood during conception and is driven by karmic impulses. This is very similar to the bhavanga. But it also seems to include subtle forms of the material elements. In other words, it has a sort of a body. The question that then has to be solved is how the subtle material elements of the antarabhava combine with the gross parental elements present in the semen and blood at conception. The point I will make here is that as the Garbha Avakranti Sutra tells us, let me go back. The embryo that comes to be when the antarabhava combines with the semen and blood of the parents in the womb is neither the same nor different from the parental elements. So the commentators use this image of worms on a leaf, right? And they say the worms, there's this relationship of dependence. The worms are not independent from the leaf, right? But they're not the same as the leaf. And that's similar to the transmigrating being, which is coming in with its subtle elements. So I would say that this image of dependence and interaction and non-separateness mitigates against the idea of the fetus as an totally ontologically distinct and autonomous being, and introduces the element of relationality. So I'm just going to throw that out there as some nuance, right, that may make us think in more detailed ways about Buddhist views on abortion. Okay, here's some more nuance. So early abortion was actually permitted in at least one Indian Buddhist school. And to understand what the more ethical argument was in that school, I just have to show you a few details about the stages of embryological development according to classical Buddhist thought, but especially the Garbha Avakranti Sutra again. So in the first 4 weeks, there's this progression through 4 different stages. But the embryo at conception is already, according to this tradition, already endowed with consciousness, the faculty of touch as well, and the life faculty. So it goes through these stages. The Sanskrit names are Kalala, Arbada, Peshi, and Kana. It kind of changes shape, right, in a way that's, sort of reminiscent of what we learned about embryology this morning. Week 5 is really important. On week 5, the 5 limbs begin to develop, the 5 limbs being arms and legs and the head. And you can actually see, if you look on the upper right hand of this image from a Tibetan medical painting, you can see the kind of little protuberances, right? from the embryo beginning to form. And then in week 16, the main sense organs and heart center begin to form. The heart is considered the seat of breath. And then in week 19, all the senses are operational. Okay, so that's a little overview. There's a lot else to say about it. So according to the Mahasangika school, or at least one kind of text associated with the Mahasangika school, embryos at those 4 early stages, the first 4 weeks, are fluid. They do not possess breath, and they do not possess a full complement of indriyas, and therefore they are not yet fully human. They're not considered fully human. So the killing of embryos in this particular school at this early stage does not actually count as homicide, and therefore does not constitute a parajika offense for monks and nuns, or a serious precept violation for lay people and novices. And we see similar ideas reflected in the narrative tradition. There's a text called the Petavatu, which contains a lot of sort of karmically driven stories. And a couple of them reference jealous wives. This is kind of a trope, right? Jealous wives, jealous co-wives who cause the other co-wife to abort because they don't want the other co-wife to have a child and then kind of have more power in the family. But there again, these, we'll talk about the kind of tone of those stories, their attitude towards women in a second. But I just wanted to point out that one of the stories involves a 2-month-old embryo. One of the stories involves a 3-month-old embryo, and different vocabulary is used. So the 2-month-old embryo is caused to flow out. The 3-month-old embryo is caused to fall. And the scholar who's done the work on this, Agostini, he believes that this reflects a kind of folk practice or ordinary practice among lay people where abortion up to a certain point was considered basically a restarting of menses and not really a serious ethical problem. Okay. So we've taken a closer look at the ontological position in Indic Buddhist sources. We've noticed some nuance, ambiguity, internal diversity. I'd like to now talk about the perversity position quickly. So again, this is the argument that abortion is morally impermissible because it encourages sexual perversity, especially in women. Although most scholars of Buddhist ethics have emphasized the ontological position, a perversity position does exist in the early sources. So here's a couple of examples from the Vinaya itself. On the left, you have a woman who had an affair and then became pregnant and asked a monk to help her obtain abortion. On the right, we have the co-wife story again, where there's 2 wives. One is jealous of the other, and she tries to cause an abortion in her co-wife. So for me, this would be an example of the perversity position. I would call this an expression, a description of abortion as resulting from especially female unvirtue around sexuality. Okay. We're not going to do that one. All right. So we've taken a look at the ontological position. We've noticed that in early and classical Buddhism, there's a perversity position of sorts. But I want to note one other aspect of early and classical South Asian discussions of abortion before I close. And that is the relative erasure of the mother altogether, actually. So I was really struck by this comment by Jeff Wilson. He did a study, a practice of the Japanese ritual of misokokuyu, a ritual of apology to aborted and miscarried fetuses. He wrote a book about that ritual coming to America. And he makes this comment about how modern medical imaging allowed the fetus to come to the foreground as a fully ontologically and morally significant individual while decentering the mother. He sees this as a function of modern imaging technology, but in fact, the mother is I would argue that the mother is barely present in classical Buddhist descriptions of rebirth in general. The fetus has always been the morally important subject. When the mother is discussed, she is often described as being in an agonistic relationship to the fetus. And that's certainly true in the Garbha-Avakranti Sutra, which may be a bit of an outlier, but I do think there's a kind of sense that the mother is a problem. This pattern of leaving out the subjectivity and moral importance of mothers is replicated in the scholarship on Buddhist ethics, I feel. So this is a comment by Robert Florida, who wrote several articles on abortion, the ethics of abortion, in which he speculates on the kleshas, or mental impurities, that motivate abortion. Personally, I don't think this description, well, it's not just personal, I don't think this description accords with data. I don't think this description actually reflects the thinking and motivations of women who have abortions. I do not think women typically do so selfishly or out of hatred towards the fetus. I think women who have abortions often make very careful and clear-eyed decisions. They deliberate, right? It's not a kind of, haze of ignorance that results in their decision to have an abortion. And, Florida had only, well, actually, this did not exist. This website did not exist, I think, when he wrote this article, but there is a website called the Abortion Diary, which is a massive archive of women's abortion stories. And if you explore the archive, you hear a lot of ethical reasoning and very conscientious decision-making, I think very similar to what the last speaker was talking about with respect to frozen embryos. Okay, so in conclusion, I'm actually going to make a few constructive suggestions, which is not really my job as a scholar, but I do think that, I'm going to do it anyway, I think. The suggestions I'm making are really coming out of what I see in the tradition and what I see being left out, not just in the Buddhist tradition, but in the way we talk about abortion in general. So one is, I think, if we would like a more pragmatic, complete, and equitable ethics of abortion, whether Buddhist or not, we should identify and critically assess the perversity position when it pops up. I don't think it is helpful for thinking about the ethics of abortion. So that's number one. And number two, I think it makes sense to integrate the mother's subjectivity into the ontological position, so as to more accurately represent the very real, tangible, documentable interdependence and relationality of pregnant person and child. I think that Buddhist psychology and metaphysics and embryology provides actually many tools for doing so. In fact, one could see pregnancy, which is a condition in which a self lives inside a self, one could see in a state of total interdependence and constantly evolving relationship, one could see pregnancy in that way as a great example or a kind of case study or thought experiment for exploring the Buddhist doctrine of no self. Thank you.